Hello to you all. I think we're going to begin straight away. We don't have a lot of time, and we especially don't have a lot of time for this session because Tony has gone through a remarkable amount of material in his book. And actually, Tony, I want to begin with a question about that. I think you deserve, when the non-fiction prizes come out this year, there should be a separate class of award for you for the most amount of information packed into a single thesis and volume. Uh, it was a riveting read, and I want to ask you, how does such a big project begin? I can't imagine a bigger question in India today for our generation than how all of us who are on the stage, what are the stories and the threads that bring us together across 80, 90, 100,000 years of time? And that's the story you tell in the early Indians. So can you tell us something about whether you began with a smaller core as your focus and how the frame of your project expanded? What is the structure of this book?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Chandrahas. I did not start with the idea that this book is going to be about the ancestry of how we formed and who our ancestors were. It was a much more limited project, a limited book, which would look at the question, who were the Harappans? And this is something that has been on my mind.
The Harappans.
The Harappans. Ever since you read about them in school, which is that we never really connected with the Harappan civilization. We read about them as like we read about the Egyptian civilization or the Mesopotamian civilization, but that who were the Harappans and where they disappeared has always been a mystery. Were they our ancestors, were they not? And why did it take, if they were our ancestors, why did it take nearly 1,500 years for cities to rise up again once the Harappan civilization went into decline around 1900 BCE. So this was what started me on the project. I thought it has been a long amount of time. And I would look at the question in a multidisciplinary manner and go across history, archaeology, philology, epigraphy, and all of this, and say in the last few decades, what have you found new that can answer this question and take us closer to the solution? Went to all the Harappan sites in India, followed that up with meetings with scientists and historians who have written research reports on the sites, and it answered some of the questions, but left me with even more questions.
Yeah.
But one thing became clear, that the answer to the question of who were the Harappans will be the same as the answer to the question who were the first farmers, because we can see from the archaeological record that the Harappan civilization gradually and naturally grew out of the agricultural revolution that happened in northwestern India thousands of years earlier. By about 7,000 BCE, we can see the emergence of the first beginnings of agriculture. But then, so the question expanded from who were the Harappans to who were the first farmers. Then it naturally expanded to who were the first Indians.
Yes.
So I had spent about 2.5 years on this project when a new kind of evidence and reports started coming up about how different population groups were formed in Europe, in America, in Southeast Asia, all over the world, including in South Asia. And this is from these reports were coming from a comparatively new field called population genetics.
Yes.
And which I was not aware of very much. I mean, in a vague manner, aware of then. And then again, it took a lot of time to understand the new discipline, which often came out with contradicting reports. And then a dramatic thing occurred about 4 years ago.
Yes.
When geneticists acquired the ability to extract ancient DNA or DNA from people who lived thousands or tens of thousands of years ago. And this was dramatic and changed our understanding of prehistory around the world. Until this happened, you had geneticists could look at the DNA of currently living populations, say in India, in Europe, in China, and then say which of these population groups are related to whom, how closely and how distantly.
Yes.
Which is very interesting. But it could not answer the question, how did that relationship come about? Who moved where to cause that relationship? Did these guys move here or these guys move there? And this is the question that ancient DNA solved. How? Because let's say if in Bangalore, you have an archaeological site
Yeah.
and that you have from a level that is 5,000 years ago, and you find a certain ancestry. But let's say there is no West Eurasian ancestry 5,000 years ago in Bangalore.
Yes.
And let's say about 2,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago, you see such ancestry. Then it is a clear conclusion that between those two periods, a new ancestry came into Bangalore. So this is how ancient DNA, which has happened, changed our understanding of prehistory across the world. Now we know the Europeans, for example, are a mixture, are a result of three major migrations. In the last 10,000 years,
Yes.
their population has turned over twice because of two major migrations. In around 9,000 years ago, a group of people from West Asia, the West Asian farmers, moved into Europe, displacing or mixing with then existing hunter-gatherers in Europe.
Yes.
And then again, 5,000 years ago, Central Asian steppe pastoralists moved into Europe, displacing or mixing with, to a lesser extent, the then existing farmers and whatever remained of the original hunter-gatherer population. That's the European population. Similarly, we know about Africa. Similarly, we know about Southeast Asia. Similarly, we also know about South Asia. So this is what changed the entire picture of our understanding, and that's how the book.
If you just sketch out for some of the people here who might not have read your book, I think perhaps we all know the basic fact that humanity as we know it, modern Homo sapiens, all of us emerge, at root we are all Africans.
That's right.
But when does Homo sapiens arrive in India, and when they arrive here, do they find an untenanted subcontinent, or are there already other earlier species of the genus Homo
yeah.
existing in India?
Absolutely right question. Yes. The out of Africa migration, which we know happened, which is a small subset of the African population of Homo sapiens or modern humans, moved out of Africa into the Arabian Peninsula around 17,000 years ago, and then went on to populate all of the world. Into South Asia, into Southeast Asia, all the way to Australia, into Europe, everywhere. The last continent that they populated was the Americas, and that was about 16,000 years ago.
Yes.
So between 70,000 and 16,000 years ago, the modern human spread, this coming from this small subset of the African population, spread all over the world.
All over the world.
They reached India, we now know, around 65,000 years ago. And when they reached here, they were faced with an already existing and robust population of other Homo species. We do not yet know what species they belong to. It could have been Homo erectus, could have been someone that, because we only have one fragment of a skull.
Yes.
That's about 265,000 years ago. Otherwise, the only thing that we have in abundance, especially in central India and southern India, or what's called peninsular India, abundance of stone tools, which suggests there was a robust population of other Homo species in this subcontinent far before modern humans arrived around 65,000 years ago.
Yes. So, in a way, if I'm understanding you correctly, the way we are decoding these very complex stories is by looking at a mixture of archaeology and the encounters of technology, and also the history of climate, isn't it?
Yes.
In your book, you put all these strands together to make a thesis that is broadly persuasive.
Yes, I think we now have the genetic evidence is the last piece of the puzzle that has fitted in, and it fits in very well with existing evidence that we have from archaeology, from linguistics, and from various other disciplines. Now, what we know is that when I said we today know how the world different population groups in the world were formed, we know that migrations were a major part of the story of the formation of all population groups.
Yes.
But when you say migrations, migrations happen all the time in all the places. So how do we figure out? But we now know that there is a structure to it. There are four major classes of migrations that shape the world demography as it is. The first one we already talked about, which is the out of Africa migrations.
Yes.
And that, you could say, were driven by climatic factors, like all other animal migrations too.
The world becomes warmer and there's more fertile land or wetland available.
It could be for both for push factors and pull factors, but it's essentially climate that controls when when these out of Africa migrations happen into various regions. Into America 16,000 years ago, it happened because at that time it was possible, there was a land bridge, etc. So that was the first set of migrations. The second set of migrations is very interesting. But before I do that, as these out of Africa migrants were spreading out, what happened is very interesting. There is a glacial period intervened around 29,000 years ago to around 12,000 years ago, a glacial period when there was great aridity and different regions got separated from each other, which meant that different population groups started evolving slightly differently, accumulating small minor genetic differences. And that's how we see there are different population groups that genetics can talk about. But we must remember that 99.9% of the DNA of all modern humans are the same. So differences that we are talking about are really minor. But after the glacial age ended, a very major and important thing happens, which is that modern human population groups across multiple parts of the world, especially Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, China, they start cereal cultivation. And people who start are lucky enough in places where they can domesticate cereal, as opposed to, say, tubers, are in a very lucky situation because it gives great productivity and people settle down, and then population just explodes. There is no comparison between the way hunter-gatherer populations explode and settled farmer populations explode. And the natural consequence of that population expansion is migration. And that migration shaped almost all parts of the world. Nothing was left behind. That's the second set of migrations. Third set of migrations start when one modern human population group gets far higher mobility than others because they domesticate horses. And they learn how to ride horses. And they also master the art of metallurgy better. And what this means is that this group from Central Asian steppe move across both towards Europe and towards West Asia, South Asia, all the way up to China, and changing the demography of a large part of Eurasia. That's the third set of migrations. The fourth set of migrations we are all familiar with, we have all discussed it, which is the colonial migrations, which is a result of a set of modern human population groups getting mastery over the seas and inventing steamship, and they can move into places where other people live. And it completely changed the demography of the Americas and Australia, for example, but it left little mark on us because the people who came as part of colonial migration, they were too few compared to the existing population to leave a genetic mark. So Indian population, you can say, is the result of 3 classes of migrations and 4 migrations. Because there are 2 farming-related migrations that happened from West Asia and East Asia. So these 4 migrations are what shaped Indian population as it is today.
Okay, so that's the big frame at which we then arrive to, in your book, to focusing on just on our part of the world and what happens thereon. And essentially, the core of your thesis is that all of us Indians today substantially come from the same stock. Or am I not making the point exactly as...
no, you're correct. I'll just put a... Today we know that almost all population groups in the country... Before I go into that, let me explain. I said four migrations out of the 3 classes of migrations. 4 migrations. What are these 4 migrations? The out of Africa migrants who reached here 65,000 years ago. There was a West Asian or Iranian, a population related to West Asian or Iranian agriculturist populations that were there in northwestern India from around 9,000 or 10,000 years ago. And that's the second major migration as they mixed with the first Indians. And it is that mixed population of West Asians and first Indians that spread agriculture and created the Harappan civilization. And when the Harappan civilization declined, around 1900 BCE because of a long drought, not Aryan invasion, a long drought. Could be, we don't have any proof of the Aryan invasion causing the Harappan civilization decline. We know that it declined due to climatic factors. So when that happened, they shifted both North India and South India. So that's the second set of migrations that shaped. Third, we know that as a long tail of the Chinese agricultural expansion, there's a group of people who migrated all the way across Southeast Asia, and the tail end reached India, and they brought Austroasiatic languages. These are languages such as Khasi and Mundari, spoken by tribals in central India and eastern India, and they are closely related to the Mon Khmer family of languages spoken in East Asia, in Vietnam, in Laos, etc. So that's the third set of migration, also agriculture related. The last set of migrations is the only one of which anybody objects, which is the Arya migration, which is the steppe pastoralist migration that we talked about, that reached in Europe 1,000 years before they reached South India. That happened between, now we know by genetic evidence, between 4,000 to 3,500 years ago. That 500-year period is when that migration happened. And all population groups in the world, in India today, you will see are mixtures of these population groups.
Yes.
And and what genetic evidence has also shown is that you see, by around 4,000 years ago, that's 2000 BCE, all the four major migrations are in the out of Africa migrants are in, West Asians are in, East Asians are in, the Central Asian steppe pastoralists are in around 2000 BC, and it's a dramatic period, the most tumultuous period in the history of the subcontinent, because what all happened? Just imagine. The Harappan civilization fell apart because of a long drought. They moved looking for new ways of life. They were at this precise point of time, there are new migrants coming in from East Asia, bringing Austroasiatic languages. At this precise point of time, there are also new migrants coming in from Central Asia, bringing new, horse riding, and they mix with the existing people of the Harappan civilization that has moved into North India and South India. So it is this 2,000-year period, from the decline of the Harappan civilization to the beginning of the Common Era, genetics says there was population mixing of the kind that was never seen before or after. And to the extent that today, no matter which population group that you pick up in India, no matter how remote it is, you will find that it is a mixture of these four migrations in some combination or the other. The only group that stays outside of this are the Andaman Islanders, because they are cut off from the mainland and the migrations did not affect them. So this is the four migrations that shaped the Indian population.
What I'm enjoying very much about this conversation is that you speak about 3, 4, 10,000 years ago, the same way people speak about 3, 4, 5, 10 years ago. And the scope of this is delightful as we go up and down through the millennia. At some point, you're right. And I found this very interesting because in a way, it seemed to me, I work in, like as novelists, you work in a much smaller frame, trying to expand the life of a single human being, not to expand the life of all of human history. But at some point, you're right. If you were to identify a single person who embodies us Indians the best, who do you think it should be? Ideally, it should be a tribal woman. Please explain.
One of the things about the, ancestry, when you look at the ancestry of the Indian population, initially we looked at what's called mtDNA, which is only a small part of our entire DNA that every human being carries. But it is mtDNA is transferred to the maternal line. That's from mother to daughter to daughter to daughter to daughter.
This is mitochondrial DNA. Yes.
The men also get it from their mother, but they don't pass it on neither to their daughters nor to their mothers. Or the line is entirely through the maternal line. Similarly, there's also Y-DNA, which goes from father to son to son to son to son. Now, initially, when geneticists were making the ancestry of people, Indian people, they looked at the mtDNA and figured out that almost 90%, 70 to 90% of Indian population mtDNA are descendants of the first Indians who arrived 65,000 years ago. And this is what, at that point of time, led to scientists saying, there have been no major migrations in India after that.
Yes.
But then, when they started looking at the Y DNA, they found a totally different picture. In the Y DNA, the ancestry of the first Indians is far lower, up to about 40%, depending on which population groups that we are looking at. So, what accounts for this dramatic difference? It is that new migrations often displace the local population, and this is something that has happened not just here, it has happened in Europe, it has happened all over the world. Displaces the local population of local males from the genetic pool. And to some extent, all migrations might have had contributed to this. So both YDNA and mtDNA are small parts of our total DNA that we carry. But this is important to remember. So this is one of the reasons that you say this. Second is that now we know today that no matter where in the caste hierarchy you are, no matter which region you inhabit, no matter what language you speak, most population groups in India carry 50 to 65% of their ancestry from the first Indians. That's the dominant. I use the metaphor of the unlikely metaphor of the pizza to explain the Indian population base, and that's the base, the first Indians. And we also know that the Harappan civilization, as we discussed, was built by a mixed population of West Asians and First Indians. So First Indians were very much part of the first civilization to arise in this region. And the Harappan civilization was the largest civilization of its time. We often did not realize it. It was as big as the Mesopotamian and the Egyptian civilizations put together in terms of population and in terms of area. So first Indians were there in the Harappan civilization. They were co-creators of the Harappan civilization. They are the largest ancestry, the base of the population. And as I said, the mitochondrial DNA, almost to a very large extent, comes from the first Indians. All of these things is what led one to say that if you were to take someone who is representative of all of our history,
Yes.
From the earliest period, it would be a tribal woman.
Now, you write in the beginning of this book, and I think that's why it's so exciting and why everybody should read it. I think your title is very resonant for two reasons. It's not only that the book is about the first Indians, it's also that we are the first Indians who are able to unpack the story of those first Indians. So it's a kind of doubly resonant title. And in a way that makes it, that leaves a huge responsibility on us to be able to embrace and absorb this story, because otherwise we are proceeding down, we are telling an old story about our past in our heads, isn't it?
Yes, it completely changes the picture. And I think the amazing thing is that this is not often understood, because both media and others have a habit of looking at one part of the story.
I know, yes.
And not forgetting the bigger picture. The bigger picture of the new scientific findings is a strong message of unity. In what all ways? First, as I said, the base of the pizza is first Indians, is the people who were here 65,000 years ago. And that's the largest part, no matter where in the caste hierarchy or what language you speak, etc., which region you inhabit. And what that means is that until now, the rest of the Indian population has looked at the tribals as someone very different from them. What this says is that's completely baseless. Tribals are the most closest relatives that the rest of the population has. They have no closer relatives. That's one. Second, we now know that the Harappan spread out when their civilization declined to both North India and South India. They're carrying both their genetic ancestry as well as the culture and the culture that they had incubated in the crucible of their civilization. That's another entire chapter altogether. How many of your current habits that we take for granted can be traced back to the Harappan civilization? And that's the common heritage of all Indians. That's new. We did not know this. We also know from genetics. I said there was a 2,000-year period when there was mixing. That mixing came to an end, genetics says, around 100 CE. That's about 2,000 years ago. Around 2,000 years after the arrival of the Arya. Now, this is important. This once clearly says that what happened around 100 CE? In genetic parlance, it's that people stopped mixing, or they started marrying within their own communities. And this I've called endogamy. And endogamy is a distinctive mark of the caste system.
Yes.
So what it means is that the caste system began only around 100 CE, long after all the migrations were in and all the mixing had happened. It also it says therefore that the assumption that the caste system began with the arrival of the Arya, at least as a general practice, does not hold. And what happened in 100 CE? One would guess that it was a political development that happened around then. We need more research to find out what exactly happened. But it did not begin with the arrival of the Arya. And this fits in with the fact that in the earliest text that we have, the Rig Veda, there's no mention of the caste system.
Yes.
It comes much later, in much later creations. And in fact, people often used to mention one sloka in the Rig Veda from the 10th mandala called the Purusha Sukta, which talks about the Vaishya coming from the thighs, the Shudra, etc., etc. But now we know that 10th mandala itself is the latest, more recent creation of the Rig Veda. More importantly, it is quite likely that it was a later addition that was put to justify the system. So the system arose far later, and therefore what we can today say is that the caste system has no genetic rationality or has no divine origin either. It has a political origin around 100 CE. So all of these ways in which you look at the message of the new findings is something that is highly uplifting, and it's a unifying message.
So you're saying the caste system has no genetic rationality. All those marriage classifieds in the Sunday sections of the Bangalore Times are all for no reason at all?
There is a political reason that is 2,000 years old. It's pretty long. When you're talking about 65,000 years, 2,000 years looks pretty old.
Yes.
But 2,000 years is pretty long by normal history standards.
We have 2 minutes left. As you can see, this is a conversation which we could all take into Koshi's bar and have a great chat at night. But I'm going to ask you one last question, ask for a short answer. There's something very thrilling about your book, which is that it takes the latest techniques of analysis, but in the midst of all that, sometimes you take us so far back into history, and there's many delightful little touches about material culture. I especially enjoy that bit where you say you can tell the difference between when humans domesticated wild plants from the sheen that you see on the handle, on the blades of sickles, because they react differently to domesticated cereals. What in the course of all these years of writing, what object from the past did you come across that you still remember very vividly as something that in a way opened up the past for you?
It has always been this picture, which is on the cover.
Oh, what is that?
This is called the dancing girl, but it's traditionally called the dancing girl, but she need not be dancing. She could be standing there.
Yes.
And it was recovered from the Mohenjo-daro site, and it's there in the National Museum in Delhi. And it has always captured my imagination because the way that it is sculptured, the stance, the insouciance, it's not a large sculpture. It's a small one, but it's almost life size. And then you realize that this goes. If you had to pick one person to stand as the early Indian, we got that from the civilization itself, and that was a revelation.
I can still see that pose in tribal Orissa, where I go sometimes once every year. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is a book you must read, Early Indians, and a big round of applause to a man who's put together a story of who we all are, Tony Joseph.
Thank you very much, Chandrahas. It's great.